Hi, I am Madeline James, and I've had the extreme honor of getting to interview Guy Windsor and ask him a ton of questions from a writer's perspective about sword fighting and martial related things. If you are in the sword fighting community, you've probably already heard of him, but for the rest of you, Guy Windsor is a world-renowned instructor and researcher of medieval and Renaissance martial arts. He has a blog, courses, a sword fighting school, and an entire method on learning sword fighting. His website and past podcast have a ton of free resources and information, but he also has a lot of published books. Most interesting to us is his book, I think it's Sword Fighting for Writers, Game Designers, and Martial Artists. And Guy actually reached out to me after one of his students was telling him about my learning sword fighting to help with my writing. And long story short, I ended up reading that book. I loved it. I will talk about it more in my next sword fighting side quest video. And I asked him if he would be willing to answer a bunch of questions I have as a writer and letting me film it. So here we are. Guy is an all-around expert in historic martial arts, and he's a really nice guy. I will have links to all of his things in the description, so please check it out. I'd love for you all to support him, whether that's by checking out his podcast, getting his book for writers, supporting him on Patreon, or checking out his blog. There's a ton of great stuff out there, and I really, really appreciate his time, and I think you're really going to enjoy what we talk about. So now, before we get into the interview, I'm going to split this video into two parts with a potential for future parts because I've already thought of more questions for him. There will be chapters below, and also I want to give a trigger warning for people. We will be discussing historic sword fighting. We will be discussing what it's like to write about sword fighting, things that you would need to know about. This includes injuries, some of the discussions of which are a little bit graphic. It's not very gory, I don't think, but if anyone is particularly sensitive to that sort of thing, this is not the video for you. We will be discussing what it feels like to be stabbed, what it feels like to stab someone else, that sort of a thing. Yes, so with that aside, let's get started, and here is part one. So the first set of questions is just like general kind of sword fighting related questions. The first one being, do you have any top like pet peeves for how sword fighting or the portrayal of swords in general is shown in media?
Yeah, I usually shut my eyes when the swords come out. It's like, no, I don't want to see this. It's going to be horrible. And it almost invariably is horrible. There are a couple of exceptions, but basically, a sword is not a clumsy sort of weapon produced for amateurs. It is a sophisticated, expensive weapon that's been produced for usually pretty high-level professionals. Okay? And what we tend to see is these really hard, like smacking the weapons together in a way that's just going to destroy them, smacking the weapons into each other's armor, which makes no sense at all because armor actually works and you don't generally cut through it with a sword. And it basically fighting the way you would with a stick, where you have to hit the person really hard because impact is all you have. Okay. Whereas with a sword, yeah, there may be some occasions where you will actually hit very hard, but generally speaking, you're using the sharp edge. So this is usually at its worst when you see a supposed instructor teaching usually the hero or the hero's sidekick or somebody like that. And the way they do it, every blow is so overcommitted that if you did actually hit the student or you did actually hit the instructor, you would kill them or chop their arm off or break all the bones in their body with one blow, right? And the thing is, the problem with giving a lesson like that is for the student to learn, they have to be failing at the optimal rate, right? Which means that not everything they do is going to work, but a majority of what they do should work, which means they should be hitting the instructor a lot, and occasionally the instructor should be hitting them. But the thing is, if you're hitting with maximum force every time, the instructor hits the student once, and that's the end of the lesson for the next 6 months while they recover, and then they can come back in for the next lesson, right? So this kind of mindless and foolish overuse of force is the main thing that really annoys me, because these are sophisticated weapons, and they're also extremely effective if you hit somebody with full force. I mean, even if they're wearing protective gear, it's going to hurt. And even if they're wearing full armor, it's going to damage the armor, which is expensive, damage the sword, which is expensive. And if you actually hit the person, then you're going to kill them. And that's not what the teacher is supposed to be doing with their student, right? It's very bad form to kill your students. So yeah, that's the main one. It's like treating swords like they were clubs.
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of historical K-dramas lately, and they are,
okay.
I don't think they are even intentionally trying to make it look realistic, but the like jumping leaps and the like in the bind just staring angrily is a lot.
Yeah, and the thing is, there are conventions for the presentation of martial arts on screen and stage, right? And particularly in China, in Korea, places like that, they have a sort of a stylized version of the martial arts of their country, which are presented in a particular way, which have the extra flashy bits and the backspins and the leaping stuff, and that's kind of part of it.
Yeah.
Right? In the same way that, I don't know, in Westerns, the cowboys almost never need to reload. Yeah.
Yes.
Like there is unlimited bullets. Yeah, and it's not supposed to be realistic. They're not trying to. This is exactly how it was in, I don't know, 1297, right? And it's reasonable that we have a similar kind of degree of tolerance for the European type weapons used in a kind of historical or fantasy type context, right? But the thing is, when you look at these like Korean dramas or whatever, we're talking super high level martial artists doing incredibly sophisticated and difficult stuff. These are serious athletes, right?
Yeah.
Who are doing a stylized version of the art that actually works, but still, it's hugely impressive to watch. The same sort of situation in, I don't know, a Game of Thrones type scenario, or in some of these more recent ones based on like 13th century duels and whatnot. And there are a couple that have come out recently. You're supposed to be representing highly trained warriors, and you have them behaving like thugs. You have them using their swords in a way that makes no sense at all. And most damningly, you have them looking clumsy, right?
Yeah.
Instead of looking like high-level athletes, high-level performers, highly sophisticated martial artists who are doing a stylized version of their art for the sake of the screen, they just look like morons. And that's, to me, it just like, why would I want to watch this person just be stupid?
Yeah, because that's not even entertaining.
Right. It's just like it ruins the character when you have someone who is supposed to be good at sword fighting, for instance, right? And they are moving clumsily. Like every mirror neuron I have is telling me I would never want to move like that. That just feels awful. Right? I kind of shoulder rolling and all that kind of rubbish. It's like, God, no. Right? So I would really like it if shows like Game of Thrones, or name the fantasy or historical genre if you like, of your choice, I would like it if they actually trained the actors in the same way that, for example, Tom Cruise was trained for The Last Samurai, or Keanu Reeves and the rest were trained for the Matrix movies. Right? They spent 9 months learning Kung Fu, like hours and hours a day learning Kung Fu, and they look banging on the screen.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. And it's totally stylized, and it has all sorts of, well, you wouldn't do that in a street, like you want to go fighting in the street anyway. But they look good, right? Even though it's stylized. And so it's not the stylization I have a problem with, it's the clumsiness.
That's fair. That sort of answers a bit of my next question, which is just going to be if there's any like particular depictions of fights or sword fighting related things that were particularly great in your opinion, which I mean, you definitely called some out.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, the duel in The Princess Bride is not historical rapier at all. Okay. but it is fantastically good stage sword fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a book written by Cary Elwes, who he plays, I can't believe I'm blanking on that, Wesley. So I've only seen the film like 50 times, and the duel another 100. So his book's called As You Wish, and he describes what they did in preparation for that fight. And they trained for weeks and weeks and weeks. Every waking hour where they weren't on set doing something else, they were practicing the sword fight. Right. And it shows. It is stylized. It has a couple of silly sounds pejorative. Should we say amusing moments? It perfectly portrays the characters. It perfectly sets the scene. It's narratively, it is perfection. And the way that it's done is perfection. It just isn't what you would expect to find if two like historical people in 1610 were actually having a real fight with rapiers. Well, of course not. That isn't the point. Right. But it is beautifully well done. So it's a really good example of the stylized stage combat stuff done beautifully well with a European type weapon. If you go to Ridley Scott's The Duelists, now Ridley Scott has covered himself in shame and ignominy lately, so I don't want to give him any word fame, but back in the day, he was actually quite good. And The Duelists, it has many fights in it, and they are all excellent for what they are. So there's this fantastic duel with sabers on horseback, right? And there's this duel with sabers in a basement, which is just brutal. But the opening scene is actually my favorite. You have two people who do not know small sword dueling with small swords. One is a trained killer, Harvey Keitel, and the other one is the son of the mayor who has just insulted this soldier, whatever. I forget the pretext for how the fight happened. And the son of the mayor clearly has some sort of fencing training, but he's not a trained killer. And the fight goes exactly as it should, right? Again, it's not what you would hope to see if two master swordsmen with the small sword in the late 18th century, what you would see if they came together, right?
Right.
But that's not what it's supposed to be. It's these two specific characters, and this is how they would behave with those weapons, and the outcome went as it should. So, great example. In books, it's harder because writers do tend to fuck it up a lot. And just because, again, most writers have no experience of actual fencing or martial arts. That is getting a lot better. Right. And, obviously we met because one of my students let me know about your project to train historical martial arts to make your writing better. And I was like, I am 100% behind that. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
But you can really tell, like for Armored Combat, the best writer of Armored Combat probably ever is Christian Cameron, who also writes as Miles Cameron, particularly his Ill-Made Knight series, because Christian flew to Finland to train with me for a week while he was thinking about writing this series, and has become a respected colleague in his own right, because he's done all the research, done loads of training, has done a pilgrimage wearing armor. He lives that experience as closely as you can.
That's awesome.
So he does. So when he writes about what armor feels like, it's because that's what it feels like when you actually wear it. And when you've been going all day in armor, where does it rub? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He knows exactly where it rubs because he's been there. And all the paraphernalia around. Yeah. So there are some people who are doing it quite well. But again, I tend not to read too much sword and sorcery stuff if the swords are too important to the story, because the swords are almost invariably wrong and it's annoying. So I tend to read other things.
So my last question in this section, which is a bit of a joke question from someone in my Discord,
Okay.
But they are hoping that you can settle, and this is quotes, definitively and finally, and with no
Yep.
hemming and hawing, who would win,
Okay.
European longsword or katana?
Well, I mean, neither, because they're weapons. They just sit there on the ground until someone picks them up. Right? Okay.
Fair.
The
Fair.
real answer to that question. Okay. In terms of like ability to do damage, the weapons are comparable. And in
Okay.
terms of ability to take damage, the weapons are comparable. Okay, they're not the same, but they're comparable. It's not like one is fantastically better than the other. But if you're looking at, shall we say, 1500, kind of peak samurai,
Mm-hmm.
and you're looking at professional warriors, so they're of the same sort of social class. You have a samurai versus a knight wearing their proper battle armor, their full
Right.
armor. Technologically speaking, the knight is so far advanced in terms of the level of protection he's getting from his armor and his ability to move in it that my money would be on the knight. And that's not just because I
Okay.
tend to practice historical martial arts. But that's just from a technological perspective. If they were
Mhm.
out of armor, 50-50.
Fair.
Yeah. So, and of course, my real answer to that question is whichever one I'm holding.
Right. Of course.
Of course.
The
Because,
obvious answer.
because you have to go into a fight believing you're going to win. So, if I'm holding a
Mhm.
katana, fine, I'll fight with a katana. I don't care. I'm
Mhm.
more comfortable with a long sword, but a sword is a sword, and you stick the pointy end in the other guy, and job done.
Right. Right.
So there was no hemming and there was no whoring.
That is true. That was a very decisive, great answer.
Thank you.
Okay, the next section of questions is from like a world building perspective, which is a lot of the area of it that I like to try and focus on.
Okay.
So the first question is methodologies for deciding, or I guess, how would you determine methodologies for deciding what type of weapons and armor a society would have used potentially when world building, if there are temperature or climate concerns, or if it's more focused on other stuff? Like, what would you be thinking about?
I think it's primarily a technological issue. So, for instance, swords became a damn sight more common in the armies of Europe when mass production became available.
Mm-hmm.
So, most of the troops in, shall we say, I don't know, 1400 are
Right.
not carrying swords. They're carrying spears, bows, axes, various other things. The knights have swords, but
Right.
the sword
Right.
is a backup weapon. Okay. By the Napoleonic era, you have troopers issued with swords, which are mass produced. And so that makes the sword a lot cheaper, a lot easier to replace, a lot easier to look after, because again, you can just replace it. And there's a, you'll just get a lot more of them on any given battlefield. So the first thing to think about really is what kind of technology are we talking about? Is every sword being handmade to order, which was rare because I mean even in pre-industrial times there were sword making industries where this factory made a bunch of blades and this factory put handles on them, and not every sword was like custom made to the individual, right? They were not mass produced the way from a modern perspective, but mass produced from a medieval perspective for sure. So they are, in a sense, a commodity. So you then have to think about where does the sword appear in the culture, right? Because a culture that prizes swords and reveres them. I mean, Japan is the famous example where it's one of the religious objects of Shinto is a sword. You've got the sword, the jewel, and the mirror, if I remember rightly. Shintoists, forgive me if I'm butchering your culture, right? But it's an intrinsic part of the culture in a way that it never really has been in, for example, Britain, right?
Right.
Yes, swords were commonly used. Swords are important. Swords are, symbols of status, symbols of like wealth, symbols of power. They are the thing that they're part of the regalia.
Right.
You think of the coronation of King Charles last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Penny Mordaunt is standing there holding this hoofing great big two-handed sword the entire time, right? Because it's part of the regalia. But the symbol of knighthood is the spurs, not the sword.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Traditionally, you were knighted by having spurs strapped on you.
I didn't actually know that.
But spurs aren't particularly an intrinsic part of our culture either.
Right.
So where do these weapons fit in the culture that you're trying to create? I mean, one thing I see occasionally is a writer has this vision of a world that has these various things in it. And I remember reading one set of books which had swords were really important. There was magic and there was swords, but there wasn't much in the way of gunpowder. They didn't have long distance communications. It was basically medieval in its overall kind of outlook, kind of Tolkien-esque, if you like.
Right.
But they had newspapers and pre-made cigarettes. Right? Because of course this character like smokes cigarettes while reading the newspaper because they're cool. Right? Obviously. And it bothered me because it's to have printed newspapers like that, you need industrial paper production, you need industrial printing, you need basically a whole level of technological integration and development that is not apparent anywhere else in the culture. Right? And same with the cigarettes. Like, why would you wrap paper? Paper is expensive if it's being made in pre-industrial mass production methods. It's expensive relatively. And so, you could be rolling your own cigarette in a bit of old newspaper, I suppose. But also, paper tastes like shit, right? So to make cigarettes palatable, you have these really, really thin papers, so you haven't got too much paper taste messing up the taste of the tobacco, right? So a pre-made cigarette indicates a level of technological development that just wasn't present anywhere else in the cultures, and that kind of bothered me. I'm a bit of a pedant. What can I say? Armor has like two main functions. Its primary function is to protect the wearer against whatever weapons are out there. So modern armor is quite different to medieval armor because modern weaponry hits you differently to medieval weaponry. The overall weight is about the same. The overall effects that it tends to have on your movement is similar. But something that's designed to stop a rifle round is a fundamentally different thing to something that's designed to stop sword blows or arrows. So the secondary function of armor is display, and part of that is so you know who everybody is on the battlefield, right? So for instance, you know the word panache, like dash and style. The original meaning for that term is it's this enormous thing on top of the knight's helmet, right? That can be literally like 3 feet long if it's ostrich feathers, right? Making you appear like 9 feet tall,
right?
Yeah, and it indicates who you are. So people can see who you are, and it will be usually some kind of reference to your family's coat of arms, right? So you see like little castles on, or little ravens, or whatever. I mean, they're these little models that are stuck on the top of your helmet to make you look bigger and fiercer, but also to tell everyone who you are, right? And you have your surcoat, and if you have shields or whatever, the shield is painted with, again, basically your ID. So again, everyone knows who you are. And this is super important for several reasons. Firstly, so you know which side you're on, but also, if you're rich enough to be wearing armor, you're rich enough to be ransomed, and so your people are more likely to try and knock you down and take you as a prisoner and then sell you back to your family than they are to kill you, because your value is greater than the value of just your armor and weaponry, right? So they can kill you and nick all your stuff, or they can take you alive with all of your stuff, keep all of your stuff, and get a bunch of money from your family, right?
Yeah.
I mean, probably the most famous example of this is Marshal Boucicaut, who led the French vanguard of knights at Agincourt and was captured and was taken to England. And he died in captivity in England. I mean, captivity. He was like an honored guest in a castle, but still, he couldn't really go anywhere. He died in captivity because the French crown could not afford his enormous ransom. Right?
Oh my God.
I mean, yeah. So this armor is this massive status symbol. Yeah. And again, this whole ransom business is a cultural phenomenon. Not every culture does it. Not every culture did it. They weren't taking you for ransom in Japan, for example. Right? If you were defeated in battle in Japan, you tended to have your head chopped off. That was the normal thing, and it was, you weren't like kidnapped and then your family buys you back. So there are all sorts of cultural preferences, cultural structures that influence what works as a fight, what counts as winning, what is appropriate to use and what is not appropriate to use. I mean, think of the Geneva Convention, right? An international agreement about what is not appropriate to use on the battlefield. Right? Oh, it's perfectly right to blow stuff up, but not with this kind of bullet, right? Which is a good thing, right? And it has provisions for the treatment of prisoners and all that sort of stuff, right? And one of the horrors of the Second World War was Geneva Convention, European military, Japanese military. They didn't get on terribly well.
Right. Very different conventions and expectations and all of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, every culture is going to have, if they have the technology for it, long-range weapons, projectile weapons of some kind. Bows are like the oldest. No, the atlatl is probably the oldest. You familiar with the atlatl?
I love those.
They're so good, aren't they?
Yeah, I have one, and it's a blast.
It seems like cheating that the spear just goes so far. They should allow them in the Olympics, and they could throw the javelins out of the stadium. So atlatls, bows, that sort of thing, slings. Then, of course, gunpowder projected weapons as well. So you then have your sort of longish handheld weapon, the longest of which is probably the sarissa, which is something that Alexander the Great's armies used. It's a spear about 5 meters long. So it's like 15 feet long. It is really long. And it is completely useless as I'm standing there wiggling my spear about because it's so long.
Right.
It's only used in formation. And you can only use it in very kind of restrictive ways because it's so big. But basically, you can stab your opponent from further away. Then you've got kind of gradations of that down to the regular kind of person length spear, so 6 feet long, that sort of thing. And then you've got sidearms like swords and daggers. So the sword has never been the primary weapon for a knight. Right? The primary weapon is the lance. The sword is the backup weapon. I mean, okay, people who study Roman history are going to be jumping up and down going, but what about the gladius? And yes, absolutely, Roman army tactics. You got a shield wall and you get up really super close and you have these little short stabby weapons and you stab in between the shields and conquer the whole of the known world that way.
Right.
So there are exceptions. But I mean, the gladius is like anything from about, 18 inches to maybe 2 feet long. It's a small weapon.
Right.
And they would start with the pilum, which is the spear with the long kind of iron shafted head. So you will tend to have weapons that fit into these different categories in whatever culture you're in. So projectile weapons, long handheld weapons like spears, sidearm type things, swords and daggers, And then you've got things like specialist weapons like poleaxes, which are for killing people who are wearing armor, because it's pretty much the only weapon that will reliably seriously hurt somebody through armor.
Okay.
And that will play across whatever your culture is that you're creating.
Right.
It's likely to have weapons in all those categories, or a very good reason why it doesn't have them.
Right. Right. And then I can see there being a lot of that emphasis on like different stages of fighting and battling based off what range you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the type of soldiers we're talking about. So, for example, 15th century Italy, the warring states period, if you like, where you've got these different city-states and they're always constantly fighting each other. But normally, they have hired professional mercenaries, condottieri, who create the army. And then the armies maneuver in the field, have a little, when one of them has serious tactical superiority over the other because of the ground or the number of people or whatever, they have a little bit of a bish bash bosh just to kind of, for honor's sake, as it were. And then they sue for terms. Right? So most of the people on the battlefield are not actually fighting, and they're not really in that much danger.
That makes sense.
But that is totally unlike the First World War. Right? Also totally unlike many, many other battles in Europe where you have, for example, a conquering army. The Romans are the classic example, going out and slaughtering as many of the enemy as they can.
Right.
So if you have armies primarily of professionals, they are not in it for glory. They're in it for money. Generally. Right. And only the living get to spend their wages. So they have a different sense of what constitutes winning. When is it honorable to surrender? Yeah. And there are, many examples of small professional forces going up and destroying larger forces. But when you have very high casualties, you normally have people there who are fighting for their home ground. Right? I mean, World War I, the French and the Germans fighting for sovereignty over their home ground.
Right.
The Germans had the Russians on one side and the French on the other, and the Serbians below, but they didn't really do very much. So it gets really, really vicious, because if one side gives up, the other side basically takes your country. Right? Whereas if you're disputing, I mean, there are many examples where rather than have like the two armies fight, you have the two armies come together and sort of negotiate for a long time, and then two champions fight. The most historically famous example of this is David and Goliath. You've got Saul, head of the king of the Israelites, and you've got Goliath, champion of the Philistines. And Goliath, for 40 days, the legend is, for 40 days, morning and night, he came out and challenged Saul to single combat. And Saul was not happy about that because he didn't want to get killed. So David volunteers and off he goes and slingshot, and the rest is history. But the point is, when Goliath fell, the Philistines ran. Right? And they ran away. And most casualties in a battle happen after one side has broken and turned to run. Because when that happens, the predatory instincts of the people chasing them, it's just psychologically easier to slaughter people when they're running away from you than when you're standing your ground and facing each other.
Right. They've lost their formations. They're not looking at you. Their back's exposed.
Exactly. They are like, a deer that you're hunting rather than a person, because you can't see their face, perhaps.
Right.
I mean, I'm not a psychologist. Right. Don't take that too seriously. But
yeah.
So whatever culture you're creating in your book, it will have some ideas about what is reasonable force, um, what is honorable, what is dishonorable but necessary, what is dishonorable and absolutely never to be done.
Right.
Because there's all sorts of wiggle room in these definitions. And I mean, some of the things that people did historically, we would say, are you fucking mad? I mean, think of like
Yeah.
the Battle of Gettysburg. These
Mm-hmm.
soldiers were walking into cannon fire.
Yeah.
It's mental, right? It's
Yeah.
like why? Well, because psychologically speaking, it was better to do that and quite likely get killed than to not do that and become, either a social pariah or be executed for cowardice.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like it's purely cultural, but the culture is that powerful. It will literally persuade somebody to walk into cannon fire or machine gun fire at the Somme rather than do the sensible thing, which is stay in your trench or run away.
Yeah, that's really crazy to think about. And it's definitely something that, from like writing a book perspective, because we all have these very like modern perspectives about
Right.
like, the logic there of what you would do, but you would really have to make sure that it is very, very clear how all that culture has been built up so that the reader understands, all these different things that they're valuing and how they're making these choices when they do something that seems illogical. You have to really like lay all the foundation work for that so that they understand culturally like why they would make these decisions or not.
Yeah.
Which is kind of crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's better dead than damned.
Right.
To most people most of the time. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, modern gang culture in Chicago or wherever else, right? These people are not behaving irrationally necessarily. There are all sorts of horrendously negative consequences to what they're often doing, but and they tend not to live very long, tragically.
Right.
But if you have a choice between being on your own and being a victim or being part of a gang and being somebody, but you're not likely to live that long, most people will choose to be somebody.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And if the culture around you feels hostile, you'll take whatever friends you can get.
That ties in a lot with my next question that we've kind of covered a little bit, but in terms of the aspects of culture and society that are revealed by like sword fighting styles specifically, we've definitely talked about it at the, like at the more like war battle stage, but or in reverse, right? What cultural societal characteristics would make certain sword fighting styles more likely?
Okay. Let's take a couple of specific examples. Right. So you have knightly combat in, shall we say, the 1400s. And the sources we have are about how knights should behave, right? And surprisingly, there's an awful lot of non-lethal outcomes allowed for in the techniques that we see, right? So with this technique, I can break your arm and throw you to the ground and stab you, but I don't have to stab you. And I can throw you to the ground, but I don't have to throw you to the ground on your neck, right? So, and part of the reason for this is you don't always want to kill your opponent. It's not always the correct thing to do for whatever reason. And in, for example, German Messer fighting of the same period, Messer is the German word for knife, but it refers to a knife that's about, it's a short sword, basically, like a machete.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff that they're doing is non-lethal. You slice up the arm, you slice open their face, you cut the crown of their head so there's blood pouring down their face or whatever, but you don't cut their throat, you don't run them through. Because the thing is, if you and some other peasant get into an altercation and you pull out your messers and you go to it and you slice the person and they are seriously injured, right, but not dead,
Mm.
and they get some medical help. And unfortunately, they died 3 weeks later from gangrene. That's
Mm.
not murder. That's an accidental death.
Right.
But if you cut their head off, you are guilty of murder and you're likely to be hanged.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
That makes sense.
it's one of the big mistakes that a lot of non-specialists make when thinking about medieval period is they think it's a free-for-all. It really wasn't.
Mm.
It was a strictly ordered society in which certain people were allowed to do certain things and other people were allowed to do other things. And yes, if as today, if you are rich and powerful, you're more likely to get away with behaving like a complete arse or being a murderous bastard. But
Mm.
even so, there were cases where people of the knightly classes were executed for rape or murder or whatever else. It happened.
Mm.
And the legal constraints around the duel or around combat determine to a large extent what actually happens in the fight itself, and therefore
Mm.
what techniques get taught. So we tend to see a lot of grappling because grappling is not necessarily lethal. And
Right.
if you and I had an altercation and you had my arms bound up like this and really cranking it on, and you had maybe you break my nose with your pommel and then you put the blade to my throat and say, do you fucking yield or do I cut your throat? And I go, I just dropped my weapon and you're terribly sorry. Let's talk about this. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is a far more likely outcome to a Messer fight than somebody deliberately murdering the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the art itself will contain that sort of thing. Now, when we look at dueling from the late 16th century, it's completely different, right? So, for example, rapier dueling, most of it is lethal. Most of the techniques we see in the books will kill you, right?
Okay.
Sword through the body, sword through the head. Those are the two most common strikes. There are a couple of cuts to the arm, a couple of cuts to the leg, maybe a cut to the head, which is unlikely, or if you slice somebody's head open with a rapier, they're unlikely to die from that because you're not likely to smash all the way through the skull. I mean, you could, but from the context in which it's occurring, it's more likely to me that it's a sort of a fight finishing nasty wound, but not likely to be lethal.
Right.
So we see those options, but most of it is you stick your sword through their face or you stick your sword through their chest, right? And the most probable outcome for that is they die. And the main difference is these are not professional warriors. These are not peasants. These are gentlemen, right? So people of the upper classes who are settling a point of honor. And while dueling is usually illegal, it's winked at, right? So we had a duel. I killed the person. You may well end up in court for murder, but you'll almost certainly get let off because gentlemen cannot be expected to accept, stains upon their honor.
Right.
So perfectly reasonable you stick a spike through their face. So while it was technically illegal, it was very often tolerated. So the cultural expectation that you'll get away with murder if it's a duel between gentlemen means that in single combat situations, you are much more likely to see lethal outcomes prioritized in the fencing styles.
My next question is, how much did the introduction of handheld gunpowder weapons change the nature of sword fighting? So both from a military and a personal standpoint, and what of those changes are most overlooked?
It's tricky because you can't run the counterfactual. Like, what would sword fighting be like if the guns hadn't been invented? So there's a sort of general thought that when guns were introduced and they became kind of really useful in the 16th century, that coincides with a lessening of the importance of armor, except the most fancy armor we find is from the 16th century, right? And people were still wearing armor and fighting with swords at Waterloo in 1815, and they were still wearing some armor and had swords in the battles in Europe all the way up to the First World War. Right? I
That's
think
surprising.
the last pattern of cavalry saber that was intended for actual use, I believe, it's not my area, so saber specialists, feel free to correct me. I think it was the 1908 pattern, so designed in 1908.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 400 years after swords are basically obsolete because guns are really good, they're still being used, and the British Army is still paying to design better ones for use on horseback, right? Which is mental, but
Yeah.
because swords have always worked, right? They are an extremely effective technology, and now it's probably not a coincidence that by the 1600s people tended to wear much less in the way of full plate armor on the battlefield, because the downside of wearing the armor is it's heavy and expensive, and if it's not going to stop a cannonball, what's the point, right? But still, a lot of the fighting is done with things like pikes and muskets, and so the musket changed a lot of things, but one thing it didn't change is the use of the infantry square. So you've got cavalry and you've got infantry, and when cavalry and infantry meet each other, there's a problem. And the thing is, if the infantry form a square, ideally 2 or 3 lines deep, and have their spears or muskets with long bayonets on or whatever pointing out of the square, the horses will not charge into the square, because horses are sentient and they're not going to run themselves onto a bunch of spikes for the sake of honor and glory.
Right.
The only example I can think of a well-formed cavalry square breaking because being broken by cavalry was at Salamanca, when rainy day a horse slipped and against its will slid on the mud crashed through the square. That created a hole in the square, and the rest of the cavalry came in and destroyed things.
That's quite the twist.
Right. Yeah. So the fact that the spear now is able to send a couple of musket balls quite quickly in that direction before it's used as a spear is important. But it didn't change things that much, I want to say.
Okay.
I think the real difference is with guns, it doesn't take that much training before someone is lethal against a trained warrior, right? The bow is much harder to master. It takes a lot more training before an archer is a threat to a knight. But, plate armor is not very good against musket balls, never has been. So if you see in a museum, you see these breastplates with like a dent in them where they shot a musket ball at the armor to prove that it's bulletproof. Well, they're not telling you, usually, is that they didn't put very much powder in the musket before they shot it at the breastplate. Because if they put the usual charge, it would have gone right through.
Yeah.
It is difficult to make steel plate that is proof against bullets and is still light enough that you can actually wear it. Like, I mean, modern bulletproof armor doesn't have any steel in it at all. It's all Kevlar and ceramic. And there's some other modern. So the point is not steel.
Right. Yeah. There's definitely a limitation there.
Yeah. I don't think we can really say definitively what effect it had on the development of armor, except eventually, of course, modern synthetic bulletproof armor, which is, of course, created by the need to have it because people are getting shot. But in terms of why plate armor generally, well, by 1800, it's just a breastplate and a backplate usually. Because if you're sitting on a horse, like, you want something that's going to protect your front and your back, and you have a helmet, and people are still wearing helmets today, and up until quite recently they were steel. So, I mean, think
Okay.
Second World War military helmets. They're all steel. And you can find, the classic sort of European and American, like a soap, like a bowl with a rim around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They had helmets exactly like that in 1300.
Hmm.
It's a good
Yeah.
design,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It
Right.
works, right? And it hasn't changed a great deal in those intervening centuries. And
Hmm.
certainly the changes didn't really have anything to do with bullets, because it's not going to stop a bullet anyway. I mean,
Right.
if the bullet is coming in at sort of an angle, it'll help deflect it. But it's mostly to protect against basically stuff falling on you or impact to the head from above, which again is a
Hmm.
bullet's normally traveling horizontally. So
Right. Right. That makes sense.
I don't think I really answered your question, but that's probably as good an answer as I can give you.
I mean, I think it shows that there's a lot of wiggle room there.
Yeah.
Where the second there's gunpowder on the field, it doesn't mean that everything is upended. Like,
No.
I don't write modern stuff, and it's a lot less common. So most of the time, like technological eras that people tend to write fantasy in tends to be either in the early ages of gunpowder or well before gunpowder. So I feel like even though it may not be like the most concise answer, like it definitely gives a direction of what to do in that case. You know what I mean?
Good. I think if you have magic
Mhm.
fulfills the same sort of functions as gunpowder and armor, right?
Right.
You use it for like destroying things at a distance, and you use it for protecting against the thing that can destroy you from a distance. The same sort of rules basically apply. And just because
Mhm.
the armor you have doesn't defend you against every threat on the battlefield, it will still defend you against some of them. So it's probably worth having.
Right. Okay, so my next section of questions is on details. All
Okay.
that stuff that, people that aren't sword fighters and all that stuff don't really get to experience, and also some stuff that even goes a little bit past just sword fighting and more the peripheral stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the first one is, could you describe some of the like tactile feelings of working with swords and sword fighting? I know that there's the book, which I will have talked about at the beginning of this video, talks about not feeling the pain in a life or death or like high stakes fight, but like what type of tactile feedback are you experiencing when you're like cutting into someone? Like, do you feel that? Do you not even like, can you,
Okay.
you know what I mean? Like,
Let the record show I have never deliberately cut into anyone.
all right.
Okay. Just get that there first.
Established.
Right. But I have done cutting practice on all sorts of substrates, including like a leg of lamb with various different kinds of armor on it, so you can feel what it feels like, for instance. So
Yeah.
basically, if a sword strike is done well against the sort of target that a sword can cut through, like for example, a person's arm and with a leather covering over it, you will slice through. You won't feel anything much back from the target at all, and their arm falls off. Right?
Fair.
Yeah. If the sword is stopped by something, bone, for instance, which can happen, or armor, for another instance, then of course you will get a kind of impact back into the hand. Okay. But if you're holding your sword correctly, even that shouldn't have that much of an effect. Okay. Let me just grab a sword and show you what I mean. This one too. So if you're holding it like an idiot, when you hit something, all the shock goes into your wrist. Yep. But if you're holding it so that when the weapon strikes something, the force is transferred smoothly through your wrist into your bones of your forearm and then through your skeleton down into the ground or into your horse, right? You really don't feel very much, even when you hit a relatively hard target very hard. So, for instance, when we're practicing striking hard, I'll have students hold a car tire out like this, and then you bash the tire, and the tire gets deformed by the blow. But it's a very resistant target, right? It doesn't deform that much.
Right.
And when I'm hitting at full speed, with full power against that target, I will feel like pressure in my hand, but there's no shock at all because I'm holding it properly. But if you hold it badly, it will shock, right? And it will feel awful, and it will hurt your thumb, and it will hurt your wrist, and horrible.
Right.
So there's what you will feel coming back through the sword is like highly dependent on how you're holding it. And that's highly dependent on how well trained you are. And indeed, there are ways of holding the sword, for example, with the so-called German grip, where the blade is basically free, and you hit with that, and you don't really feel anything because you're not resisting the impact at all.
Yeah? Right.
The sword basically hits the target and either goes through it or stops or bounces off, but the sword is basically loose in that plane, so you don't have to worry about it. So you don't feel sense. That much. So, I mean, if you hit a piece of steel armor and you hit it quite hard, you can get a bit of a nasty shock. But again, if you're hitting with the correct part of the blade, you get less shock. So, if you whack the side of the blade, there's a node here, node of vibration there, where like the sine waves of the wiggle cross.
Right.
And that bit of the blade is super stable. Right?
Okay.
So when you hit something with that, you don't really feel anything. Because
it's an interesting, right? It's an interesting thing because you normally think about like more experienced sword fighters having more endurance because they're trained for it, and they have the muscles.
That's also true. Yeah,
right. But there's also probably that level of just like you would get beat up more, like just from the reverberations and just from swinging around if you're less experienced too, which would also probably like fatigue you faster.
Right. And if you actually hit somebody, or you're hitting a lot, or you get parried a lot or whatever, if you're using your sword well, it is relatively not discombobulating to you.
Right. Not overly strenuous or...
Yeah. But if you're like, here's a classic example. Let's say I'm swinging the sword this way and somebody parries down on the blade. Okay. An inexperienced person is tense in the shoulder, tense in the arm, and that happens. And the whole body kind of goes, ugh, right? And it's horrible. An experienced person, when the slap arrives, that happens. It doesn't affect the rest of you at all.
Right.
So one of the things that marks an experienced person is how they can kind of moderate the force coming into the weapon, right, from your opponent or from the target or whatever else. And the more experienced you are, the less problematic that impact becomes.
So how does that go with so I know that in the book you talked a lot about the differences between like sparring with blunted swords and sharp swords, or I was doing sword work with both. We won't say sparring with sharp swords per se, but...
No, I do some sparring with sharp swords.
Sparring with sharp swords. Okay,
don't do it at home.
Sparring between them.
Don't do it at home. Do not do it at home.
Right.
But yes.
Right.
Okay. Several things.
Okay.
Firstly, there's in any kind of training environment, there's always a dollop of bullshit. Right? So, I mean, if you are a boxer and you're competing for the world title, the world title match in the ring is the real thing. Everything else you do is training for that and is not the real thing. It's still necessary. But for example, when you're doing pad work with your trainer, they're not hitting you the way your opponent is going to hit you. Right? Your sparring partner might try to do that, but your trainer doing pad work isn't going to be punching you in the head in the way that the other contender for the title is going to be doing. Right? For instance. So everything you do that isn't the real thing has some kind of compromise in it. Okay, for because you're training different attributes, you're training for different things. So in any kind of sparring, you have compromises that take it away from the real thing. Now, if you're a sport fencer interested in winning longsword tournaments, then the longsword tournament is the real thing, and you can get very, very close to that in training. The only thing that's missing is it's the actual tournament. You can have the same equipment, the same rule sets, the same setup, the same ring, the same weapons, everything, hitting with the same level of force, up against the same level of opponents. You can simulate it very precisely. The only difference is it isn't the actual tournament. So there's that psychological difference. But you can recreate everything else. When you're training to fight with sharp swords, obviously, if we're training with blunts, the levels of bullshit are, or the areas of bullshit include, you're not trying to kill me, I hope, right? The weapon is blunt. I'm wearing more protection than I otherwise would, probably. There are rules like what can and can't be done, which may or may not accurately reflect where we're going. If what you're trying to do is recreate the art of the period, sparring with blunts has these specific levels of bullshit in them, but it does allow you to go full speed. It allows you to work on tactics and techniques done at a level of intensity that you can't get in other environments. When you do training with sharp swords, you're taking out the bullshit of the sword being blunt, but you're adding other bullshit so that no one dies, right?
Right,
so where I have done high speed sparring with sharps, but only with people who I really trust. Also with very little protection. So my training partner, they're not opponents in this context. My training partner knows that there's no wiggle room, right? And the sharp sword can go straight through a fencing mask, right? So, so we're sparring in that it's competitive and it's done at speed, but they're not actually really trying to hit me. There's a risk of an accidental strike. There's all sorts of psychological advantages to doing it this way, but there is still bullshit, right? And it's important that with any training scenario, you understand where the bullshit is, because unless it's the real thing, there has to be some. And if you don't know where it is, you can't come up with other training approaches to kind of cover the bullshit, right? It's like the Edam cheese model of protecting against coronavirus, right? Everyone's wearing masks, great, but there's still holes. Everyone's vaccinated, great, but there's still holes. But if you have enough of these things lined up, every hole is covered and nothing bad happens, right? And the same is true with training. You want to be aware of where the holes are, or the dollops of bullshit in my model, right? So that you can create other training modalities to cover those bits of bullshit. So by the time, if you ever did get to the real thing, God forbid, but if you ever did get to the real thing, your training has prepared you for that without you ever actually having experienced it before. Right? But I mean, one of the big things about sharps is they're really scary. Here's a sharp longsword. Here's a blunt longsword with a rubber tip on the end. And yes, that could do you horrible damage, but you can see the point. Yes? Even though I'm pointing it directly at the camera, you can see the point. You know where that is. Okay? This is a sharp longsword. Where's the point?
That's really hard to, you can't see that at all.
Exactly. So when we see in, for example, 17th century rapier fencing treatises, the instruction to find the sword, trovare la spada, right? It's partly because you can't fucking see it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how long is it? I don't know. It's pointed at me, right? Because it's disappeared, but I don't know how long it is. So I start all the way the hell over here and I approach. This is a long sword, not a rapier, but you get the idea. I approach to find the sword.
Right.
right? Because I don't know
Yeah,
where it is. I
there's
can't
like,
see it.
and there's some wiggle room in the up and down, or I
Yeah.
guess on either sides of wherever the cross is, however big that is, where you wouldn't see it if it's
Yeah.
anywhere in that range too.
Yeah, and let me just do it with a sharp rapier because that's
Yeah.
there's a long sword and people are going to go, it's a long sword, not a rapier. This is a rapier. So this thing is a beast. Right? Look how long that is, right? But when I'm here, and I point it at the camera, you simply don't know how long that is.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, as I move, even as I move a little bit, you get the idea that it's long, but you know how long that is. And if I'm down here, I think, how long is my sword? In other words, how close do I need to get before I can hit you? Or
right,
how close do I
in
need
danger?
to get? Yeah, how close do I need to get before I can ram this through your skull?
Right.
Right? Just to put it in its proper context. Right? It's scary as hell. So,
yeah.
Which makes these rapier guards, and Fabris says approach as with a leaden sandal, so you're stepping slowly forwards. And if you look at Capoferro's guard position is somewhere back here, there's good reason for that. You're keeping your squidgy bits away from the point that you can't see. But as soon as there's a rubber blunt on the end, my blunt rapier's in the bag, so I'll use this. As soon as there's a rubber blunt on the end, you can see the point.
Right, you kind of know exactly where it is.
And then when the blades actually meet, it's very, very different. Let me give you an example. This is just a penknife, and this is another penknife. Okay, blunt weapons, when they meet, they slip over each other. Yeah, they don't really stick at all. Sharps, when they come together, they stick. So you get this ability to wind.
Okay.
To feel where your opponent's weapon is. Okay, so a lot of the historical stuff is easier with sharps because it requires you, having found a connection with your opponent's weapon, to manipulate it in a specific way. And that is so much easier with sharps than it is with blunts because they don't slip.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of winding stuff in some of my classes right now, and it's been very hard for me to conceptualize because it just, all you have to do is just like hit them at any point where, I mean, I guess like if you actually have a sharp sword, both, you're not going to just open yourself up like that by going for them because they'll stab you too, and that's not worth it. But also if you have that control of their blade, like that's a very, very different mechanic. Like just imagining it.
And, you know, if you're winding over the top, for example, you get so much clearer sense of where the weapon is and where it's going and how much control you have over it. And also, so if you're parrying, like with blunts, people tend to bash their edges together, and it's a horrible thing to see. With sharps, if you do that very quickly, you cut divots out of your blade. But if you're aiming your parry against the flat, you can see, right? If you're aiming it against the flat, you get that control over your opponent's weapon without damaging your edge particularly. I mean, you're still going to need to sharpen it, but it's, you know, it's much less damaging to the weapon, and you get better control. So there are all these details that are just missing if you've never done it with sharps.
Yeah, I'm very curious about it. One day I will get there.
Come to my house. I have sharps.
It's a bit far.
but actually I've done seminars in like America or Australia or whatever. Where one of the things they wanted was sharp on sharp experience. So I bring 2 sharp longswords, and I give everyone in the class one-on-one time, sharp on sharp, and everyone who wants to, obviously, no one has to do it.
Right.
And just get that sort of that feeling for what it's like when the blade is sharp, and that difference in the tactile sensation and in the tactical sensation for when the weapons are sharp. I mean, swords should be sharp generally,
right?
And yes, these aren't swords, but you know, for demonstrating to a webcam, it's a damn sight easier than having 2 sodding great big long swords.
Yeah, that's a lot easier to see what's going on. So that sort of ties into the next question, kind of talking about sharps, but then This video will continue in part 2, which will be linked below as soon as it is available, and thank you for watching.